on the American side, on the Washington side, there seems to be this desire to wrap up this war. If you look at what the US actually got from this war, it's a lot. I mean, the most obvious thing is the military industrial complex. You not only had the stocks go up, but you also had a lot of, very cynically speaking, weapons testing going on the ground, by using the lives of the Ukrainian and the Russian side. I mean, it sounds very awful, but this is really what has happened. And obviously, the U.S. was not the only country supplying weapons to Ukraine, to the Kiev side. You had British tanks undergoing testing, German tanks undergoing testing, et cetera, et cetera. So sounds pretty disgusting, but this is really what has happened. You also have the decoupling of Russia economically from the European Union. Russia obviously had quite a bit of trade going, primarily energy, but that wasn't the only thing that it was trading with different countries. For instance, was a major, tourism sounds really silly, but for some countries, for instance, in the Baltics, so the three little countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but also Finland, this was a major source of revenue, Russian tourists who went there and spent money. Now that's gone. So you can literally tune into the news, the official Western news like Reuters, almost every single day, and you'll see something awful happening in Europe economically because of this decoupling from Russia. Now, energy, of course, was the biggest thing. So, for instance, this really impacted German industries negatively, right? So, we used to talk about the German economic miracle, but behind that miracle was cheap Russian energy, which is now gone. Now, we know, of course, Europe is still avoiding its own sanctions in very roundabout ways. It's been purchasing Russian energy through third parties like India at a markup, so it's no longer cheap. But the other thing is that, of course, now is also buying energy, LNG, right, from the United States, which is much, 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 much more expensive than the Russian counterpart. So that has happened. So in a way, Europe is more, or the European Union is more subordinate to Washington than before. So there's sort of this imperial consolidation of power, as some have described it, going on. Let's make it even more cynical beyond weapons testing. The people who actually been fighting on the Ukrainian side and the war in Ukraine were primarily from the east, from the center, not so much from the west. Now, people who have been taken to the front, and we've all seen now countless mobilization videos, right, where people are forcibly caught in the streets and taken and eventually sent to the front. Those people are either ethnically Russian or Russophone or culturally Russian. So essentially you have an international war where NATO countries are backing Ukraine, but you also have a civil war between Russians or cultural Russians and Russophones. And on the Ukrainian side, a huge number of people have died. We don't know the exact number. The estimates have been as far as more than 1 million. And then, of course, Russia has lost fewer people, but it's still, not. So overall, you have a huge number of Slavs or Russians or Russophones dying in this war. So some would say that certain cynics who wanted to sort of reduce the human resources that Russia has have succeeded in this regard. But be that as it may, this is the official Washington position, right? They're trying to find an off-ramp. They may or may not have gotten what they wanted. You can interpret it in different ways. Now, going to the EU, they made it into sort of this existential battle for them, right? They've been presenting officially, coming from Ursula von der Leyen, from Kaja Kallas, and a whole bunch of other bureaucrats in the EU. They talk about it as the battle between good and evil. It's very, very Manichaean. They talk about the battle between democracy, sort of the civilized garden, right, in the EU, and the autocracy, the barbarians outside of the European Union, almost using those very terms. It sounds very, 19th century, but essentially this is what they've been saying. And so when you present it as such a dramatic battle, and on top of that, they have supplied, billions and billions of dollars of all kinds of aid to Ukraine, right, in weapons and other types of aid. They've sort of deindustrialized parts of the EU by decoupling from Russia. So financially, the EU has really been hit, different parts of the EU for different reasons. On top of that, there's this massive corruption scandal going on in Ukraine right now. It's not the only corruption scandal, it's the one that has really been covered by the Western media, where people at the highest levels of power have been implicated in misusing the money that was supposed to be going to the war effort. Some of the people were really close to Zelensky, the president. They fled to Israel. Other people have been sort of demoted. Other people fled the country. Now, the broader question is, if Ukraine is so corrupt and there's sort of hundreds of billions of dollars on the line, then which people in the backer countries, e.g., in the European Union, in the very least aided and abetted this corruption, or more, actually directly participated in this corruption. And so it's hard to imagine that the people on the ground, even people who may not be tuned into the news much, when they're hearing and reading these headlines in Europe, whether they're not raising questions like that. Like, who in our countries is implicated in this corruption case? So for the EU to just get out of this war, the implications might be pretty serious, because they're the ones who introduced 19 sanctions packages with tens of thousands of sanctions and damaging their own economy in many ways, right? They're the ones who made lives more difficult for their own electorates. They're the ones that may be implicated in this massive corruption scandal, which is, unheard of, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And so it would be much more difficult for them to get out of the situation without really having serious social and political changes within their countries. And so in a way, that seems to be why they're so attached to keeping the war going, to the point where there are rumblings about, that's not the first rumbling about introducing European armies. Now they're sort of trying to escalate the idea that Russia will invade different countries in Europe. And so France is sort of extending its military service. If you look at the British media, every day there's something about, we will be invaded soon. Although realistically, the last time Britain was actually invaded physically, we're not talking about World War II bombings, it was about 300 years ago. So realistically, it doesn't actually have much to do with reality, but the level of propaganda is through the roof. And so it sounds very tense on the European side, but ultimately, I'm not sure how much power the Europeans would have against Washington, that really seems to want to get out of the situation, because ultimately those who are winning on the battlefield and those who are in power in terms of funding this war would be making the decisions, right? Not the people, not the proverbial losers in this case.
If we talk about the gains from the Russian side, what can they be, especially the area in Ukraine, and diplomatic gains as well?
Well, this is a complicated question, because the Russian officialdom has made very consistent statements regarding what the goals of their so-called special military operations are, right? Demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, and of course the liberation of the Russophone and Russian-speaking or culturally Russian or ethnic Russian areas. Initially, they were Donbass and Lugansk. They're almost fully liberated at this point, and this is the war that began in 2014, so it's been a long, long time in the making. We talked about the Minsk agreements before, right? Ukraine had many chances to federalize and to keep those breakaway republics as part of their country, to give them basic language rights. That did not happen, and so we are where we are today. However, Russia is obviously farther advanced in other parts of sort of that same general area, right? It is in parts of Kherson, right? It's I don't know if your listeners will really know the sort of the little geographic areas that I'm mentioning, but sort of think of it as moving from Russia eastwards, going westward, but before the Dnieper, right? Before the main river that is separating east and west Ukraine. The big question is Odessa, which is on the Black Sea, right? Officially, Russia hasn't really talked at all about Odessa. However, a lot of commentators have pointed out that leaving Ukraine with access to the Black Sea would be a mistake. What we saw literally in the last couple of days is that Ukraine attacked, or Ukrainian drones attacked Russian oil tankers way, way, way out close to Turkey in the Black Sea. So some have stated this would be a good argument to actually incorporate Odessa into some kind of a future agreement where it becomes part of Russia. Odessa is interesting because it's always been a very multicultural city. Obviously, initially it had all kinds of roots, right? It was under the Greeks, then it was under someone else, eventually it was under Russia. And so these days it's still quite multicultural. And so making it a sort of a Ukrainian national project was not going to work. So we'll see what happens there. But it's difficult for me to imagine for Russia to actually sign an agreement where there is a possibility, even if on paper it says Ukraine has reduced its, armed forces, it reduced its actual armaments, weapons, etc. It's hard for me to imagine leaving Ukraine in a position where it could be rearmed or something could happen later on and it still poses a threat. So something really serious needs to happen there. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen militarily. So for instance, if as part of a certain peace agreement, Russia were to keep what it has conquered on the battlefield or regained, because a lot of those lands were historically Russian lands that were given to Ukraine administratively in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and then Crimea in the 1950s, but Crimea is back with Russia. It's really, assuming they keep that land, it's really not hard for me to imagine that eventually the residents of the other areas that are nearby would want to sort of go back home to Russia in a peaceful way through a referendum, for instance. But it's also hard for me to imagine the Russian officialdom trusting any agreement coming from the West in light of what happened with the Minsk agreements and in light of all the attempts to end the war starting from 2022. Well, actually, we can start in the late 2021 when Russia sent a document to NATO countries trying to prevent what was about to happen in a very, very reasonable way, and NATO completely ignored it. And then, as you know, in the spring of 2022, there was a famous Istanbul attempt at peace negotiations that were allegedly undermined by Boris Johnson, of all people. And that particular agreement was really detrimental to Russia, but Russia was willing to sign it. And every attempt at a peace agreement since has been more and more and more detrimental to Ukraine in relation to Russian gains on the battlefield. So you see a lot of critics saying that, oh, Russia has only gained like 20% or 25% of Ukraine. But that has never been the stated goal, right? And again, the cynic in me would say that Russia has, once it realized that NATO was not going to back down in terms of backing the Ukrainian army at any cost, in the early days of the 2022-2023 escalation, it switched to a war of attrition, which, unfortunately means killing as much of the other side as necessary, which means there's simply not going to be enough people left to fight. And so the end result of that is that we've seen these subsequent mobilization waves in Ukraine, right? Younger and younger people or older and older people have been mobilized and taken to the front, which sounds really terrible, but it's one of these situations where there is no other way of going about the way that this war has been going on with the Western backing. And so, as you know, with wars of attrition, it seems like nothing serious is happening yet. The territorial gains might be minor, but eventually there's just a sudden collapse. I'm not sure if we're near that collapse yet. I'm not a military analyst, and if you listen to military analysts, they disagree about when and how this will happen. But if things continue as they have been, it will happen. So, so.
There was a very famous incident that happened that NATO had to scramble some jets because of some drones entering into some territory of Ukraine. Do we have other incidents like that? And if you can get some more information on that.
Well, I mean, again, NATO's involvement, right? Officially, NATO is not involved because NATO is providing support, but officially it's not involved. But there's been a lot of incidents where um, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but there would be like an announcement of certain military from the West, from the US, from Canada who got sick and died. But it would be like a high-ranking official or someone was, um, the ones that drowned in a swamp in the Baltic. Like there's been a lot of those. And again, if you want to be a conspiracy theorist, you could say this all sounds a little bit fishy, where this guy had like his appendix burst or something like that. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you go read all those articles, there are quite a few of those where it is someone from the official NATO countries that was somewhere in Europe. They don't actually say it was Ukraine, but they died in a way that's very weird. Like it's like a medical emergency, but it's like a young guy, right? So you can probably extrapolate they may not have been where the official article says they've been. And so obviously drones have really changed the way the warfare, this type of warfare has looked a lot. But I'm not an expert on that, so I think you would you would need to invite someone who is much more versed in drone warfare.
So, in the meanwhile, Russia has been working on its diplomatic relations, and it looks like 2025 was a really, really a good year for Russia in terms of diplomatic relations. What do we have? What are we looking at now? Because we're watching Russia going back, making more friends, making it way better. We've also I shared the news of Yuri Gagarin, if that's how you pronounce it. A monument has been in the capital of Pakistan in a very very big, very famous park. There's a monument of him that has been made, and which is said, people are saying that this is a new beginning between Pakistan and Russia, and it is because of our sparkle. It's a what do you call it? You guys call it cosmonauts? Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah, cosmos is the Russian word for space, right? Like the Greek Russified version. Yeah.
Okay,
So
okay,
I think every country, Americans say astronauts, we say cosmonauты, cosmonauts. The Chinese say taikonauts. So each of us uses our own words for space for that.
cool.
For that.
So there's a partnership going on between Pakistan and Russia, and in the meanwhile, President Putin is also said to visit India uh, tomorrow at our time. What is Russia is like going really really good when it comes to diplomatic relations?
Well, this is interesting because what we've been getting for the past, at least 3 years, but probably more since before the 2022 escalation, is that Russia is diplomatically isolated. And of course, the reality is that it has been cut off in certain ways from Europe, right? From the official West, but that is a small part of global population. So it's a little bit naive and also very very sort of arrogant for Westerners to assume that they represent the world. So I don't know. I don't necessarily like the term global south, but we can say that Russia has been improving and deepening. The relationship was already good in many places, deepening its relationships with various countries in the global south by using various frameworks that we already have, right? We have BRICS that is expanded. We have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So as you know, Russia just had a meeting in Moscow in the middle of November, November 18th. This was a meeting at the ministerial level. So China had its own meeting in September. It was at the highest levels of government, right? It was at the leadership level. Russia had the next. So the two were connected, right? The one in Tianjin and the one in Moscow were connected. So it seems like that particular organization, that particular framework is working well. So the ministerial meeting was mostly focused on trade. And of course, economically, everything is going well. I believe the number that was given is that the Russian turnover with the SCO countries is 409 billion. Of course, unsurprisingly, most of that is with China. However, the relationship with the other countries in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been growing. Now, the countries, I mean, we know what they are, right? India and Pakistan and Iran are there, but the rest of the countries are the formal countries in the basically in the Soviet Union, not just the Soviet bloc. We have Belarus and we have Central Asian countries in your part of the world. So that is definitely good to see that there is this sort of reconnection in a new way with the former Soviet republics, the Central Asian countries. Now, Belarus is a special case because Russia and Belarus have what is called the Union State, so they're very, very closely integrated while being separate countries. So things are good there, but in terms of improving the relationship with the Central Asian countries from the former Soviet Union, that's been really important. So beyond economics, though, of course, it is also about shifting or diversifying the centers of power in the world, right? Away from the West, essentially. As you know, after 1991, after the forced dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US, right, Washington had a unipolar moment. We had a duopoly between the USSR and the US in the latter part of the 20th century during the Cold War, and all of a sudden the USSR was gone and the US was left to essentially run the world, and we know what the consequences of that were. And what we're seeing now is a somewhat of a decline of power, not just for Washington, but also for the West in general. The rise of China has been discussed extensively by many people, but it's not just China, right? It's other powers, Indonesia, for instance, with a large population, etc. So it's about, again, ideally, it's about creating a world where more countries have a say in the way the world is run, and it is mutually beneficial. So beyond these economic indicators that the ministers, the Russian Prime Minister is Mishustin, the ministers discussed in Moscow 2 weeks ago, it's about the sort of the general shift to hopefully more of a multipolar framework that is a little bit more representative of others. Now, obviously, some economies are bigger than others. China may have a greater say, but nonetheless, other countries in these particular organizations are now being recognized, and I think that's really important. Now, in regards to India, Modi invited Putin to travel there on the 4th and 5th of December. We only really know about the details from the media. So the Kremlin just released, a little bit of information about this particular trip, but it sort of fits into the same general framework of diversifying Russian partnerships, right? Russia was really focused on the West for a really, really long time, at the expense perhaps of the other countries outside the West. And it also shows that, I mean, India has been threatened, right, in terms of its cooperation with Russia very recently. It didn't really fold, but at the same time, as you know, India still tries to maintain relationships both with Russia and in the West. So according to the media, what it will be discussed is some of the military cooperation, so purchases of fighter jets and various defense systems. Now, the one that I found interesting, let me just pull this up because I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly. India wants to restore its stake in Sakhalin-1 project, which is an oil and gas project in the Russian Far East. And this was an international project that was initially backed by Japan, because Japan is right there, right, and other companies. So India's ONGC Videsh had a 20% stake in this project. According to the media, it wants to restore the stake. So In 2022, a lot of those cooperations were sort of done because of sanctions, because of international pressure. And so something like that also shows that we're coming out on the other side of the Ukrainian crisis. If this is actually true, what the media is reporting, but we see this from other countries too. We saw, I'm not sure if you saw this, but the new ambassador from South Korea, right, a country that's firmly within the Western sphere of influence, has really been trying or making at least public statements about restoring the relationship between Russia and South Korea, hopefully having Russia navigate the tricky relationship between the North and the South, because the Russian relationship with DPRK has been really deepened and improved in the recent few years. And so we're seeing sort of different language coming from some of these countries that are militarily occupied by Washington. So that's really interesting. But going back to India, I think the other things they'll talk about is the way that media is phrasing it is not very different from the Chinese partnership. They describe it as a strategic partnership in various areas, right? The economy, culture, political, scientific, technological, and military. So we'll see what happens. I'm not really sure if we can go beyond this other than what the media has reported, because the Kremlin has been pretty succinct, right, in releasing this kind of information, but we'll see soon.
Since you have mentioned Washington, how is Washington going to be looking at this? Because they've been very uh, uh, harsh with India with the words.
Yeah, I mean it seems like, again, India is really trying to cooperate with everyone and anyone in terms of maintaining its historic relationships, right? Obviously, the Russian relationship goes back to the Soviet Union, so I wouldn't be surprised if more harsh statements were to be issued, but I'm not really sure how much action would be taken by Washington in this regard. Perhaps there would be something about this increased military cooperation, but I'm not sure, because the previous statement was about India and Russian energy, and nothing really came out of that. So I'm not sure if I would anticipate something fundamentally different should India be able to, let's say, reclaim the stake in this particular oil and gas project.